All right, so this is something that Barbara already asked for, but I'll walk you through this. Some of the pronunciations in the Gayacono language itself. So this is something that and you can certainly feel free to try these out yourselves. You can be muted, unmuted, either way. But the word that I'm going to be using a lot today is Gayacono. So that's the name for what we have most often referred to as the Cayuga Nation. Everybody want to try that? Gayacono.
You had it all the way down. It doesn't make any difference. Once you go to the other speaker.
Okay, so I heard a few of you pronounced it. It sounded pretty good out there. Another thing that's a newer word that's been promoted by Indigenous people themselves is Haudenosaunee. So try that one, Haudenosaunee.
Haudenosaunee.
All right, that's sounding very good. Okay, and that's the word, the spelling there that I have right next to the bullet is in the Gayacono language. So there actually are different words for the Six Nations Confederacy, the Iroquois Confederacy in each of the languages, but they all sound a fair amount like Haudenosaunee, but they're gonna look mildly different. Since we're talking about the Gayacono today, I'm using the Gayacono spelling. So this is, I think, the change in terminology from Cayuga to Gayacono has really been motivated by community members themselves. This started really in around 2017 when there was a speaker of Gayacono who came down and started lecturing in the community. His name is Steve Henhock. Some of you may have seen him speak or heard of him speak before, but he was teaching language lessons. The language is very endangered. There are actually only 8 living people who learned Gayacono as their first language. And Steve Henhock is in his, I guess, mid-40s, and he is by far the youngest of the first speakers. So it's a critically endangered language, and part of the efforts to sort of revive it and teach it to younger generations of Gayacono, that they are encouraging non-native people to also use the Gayacono language as a way of sort of reinforcing the efforts within the community to keep the language healthy. So that means, if you give a sort of literal translation, Gayacono means from the swampy land. And certainly those of you who are from the Ithaca area will know that there are a decent amount of swamps currently at the north end of the lake in Montezuma Wildlife Refuge. But if you look at these two images here, you'll see that that was the case in the Ithaca area as well. The first settler map of this area was done by Moses DeWitt in 1790. This sort of established the boundaries of the military tract lots that would be divided up and allocated to veterans and later land speculators and others. But you can see that all through what is now the flats of Ithaca, there was a very large and impressive swamp. And then my colleague Fred Gleach at Cornell found this photograph from around 1880, which shows definitely a whole lot of standing water and wetland plants. He thinks that's probably in the vicinity of where Ithaca High School is today. So I think before there was a whole lot of filling and reclamation of swamps. We had the swampy land at both the north end and south ends of the lake. And this is really how the Gayacono chose to identify themselves. If we look at Haudenosaunee, that's the term for the Confederacy of Six Nations. So this is an alliance of 6 independent nations. I guess we can sort of think about it as being, maybe the equivalent of NATO or something like that. But what that means is people of the extended house. And those of you who've been in the region for a while will likely know that the traditional form of Haudenosaunee housing was the bark-covered multifamily longhouse. And the Confederacy was sort of conceived of metaphorically to be a big house where each of the nations was, had their own fire, but they were united under the same roof and the same common spaces. So it sort of indicates that the Confederacy was like a big family in a certain way, in Indigenous terms. So I think it's worth noting that that there's a deeper meaning to these terms in the Gayacono language, but there is really no deeper meaning to, let's say, Cayuga, which is really sort of a mangling of Gayacono by outsiders, and Iroquois also was applied by outsiders, and that actually has some somewhat derogatory connotations. So that's often looked down upon by Native people as a way of referring to them. So here's a map from around 1720 that shows the boundaries of the territories of the Six Nations of the Haudenosaunee. And you can see the Cayuga or the Gayacono. I think that that's probably a little bit too small. I think that that should be maybe a little bit wider, and it definitely should extend down to what is now the New York-Pennsylvania border, and probably south into Pennsylvania as well. So just to give you a sense of where the traditional territories were. And as of 1720, and really up until the American Revolution, the Haudenosaunee were really in sole control of these areas. There was really not much colonial presence outside of Albany or Montreal or the Hudson River. There were settlements on the Susquehanna, European settlements on the Susquehanna River, and there were a couple of isolated forts, but especially in the Cayuga Lake region, this was very much indigenous territory. And I'm going to argue in just a couple of minutes that we really don't have colonialism until about 1779. So of course, if you contrast what was going on in 1750 to what's going on today, if these were colored, clearly the entirety of upstate New York would be considered indigenous territory in 1720. And now we have only these really tiny, small pockets of indigenous territory, and the Haudenosaunee communities have been scattered from their homeland. Some have gone to Ontario, some have gone to Wisconsin, and some have even ended up in Oklahoma. And you will see on this particular map, if you look at Cayuga Lake, you will note that there is no official reservation territory in the Cayuga Lake region. That's something that Gayacono people have been trying to get, but it is still very much, the outcome of that is still very much uncertain. But the reason that you have that reduction in indigenous territory, I think if you had to narrow it down to one word, I would say it's colonialism.
I have a question about the Chippewa. What tribe would the Chippewa be associated with out here?
This is not Chippewa territory. That's really the Ojibwe peoples. I think you're really more talking about Wisconsin, Minnesota area.
Right. I thought there was some out here. No.
I'm sure that there may be some in different places, but I don't believe that there's an official reservation. Maybe in Ontario, but certainly not in New York.
Thank you.
Yep. And I saw the question from Michael Kaplikalair about terminology. So I am generally going to use somewhat interchangeably indigenous. I use native occasionally. First Nations is, I think that's okay. But First Nations is generally used in Canadian contexts, and it hasn't really caught on in the United States. Of course, there's a lot of information about labels that we could talk about. So I think I'm just going to concentrate on some of the issues of around the Haudenosaunee for today. Okay, so this is a map showing the settlements of the Gayacono, and you'll see I still have Cayuga because I made that map a few years ago in 2013. But the reason that we can be so definitive about the location and some of the names of these settlements is because these are the towns that were burned by the American Sullivan Clinton expedition. in 1779. And I would argue that this really, I think that the Gayacono had pretty firm control of their homelands until this happened. And this really was the beginning of a time when it became much, much more difficult to be a Gayacono person, regardless of where you were. So the Sullivan-Clinton invasion was prompted by a set of orders by George Washington. He basically decided that there was going to be a scorched earth campaign against the Senecas and also the Gayacono. And there were also attacks on some of the indigenous villages in the southern tier and in Onondaga territory. So really there was if you add up all of these invasions, all of the Haudenosaunee communities that the Americans considered to be their enemies were severely damaged or burned completely. The Gayacono have actually argued that in their community oral traditions that they were actually neutral as a nation. There were small numbers of Gayacono individuals who may have fought alongside the British, but the Gayacono have argued that they were predominantly neutral, and it does look like that. And there actually is an instance in the Sullivan-Clinton documentation where the Gayacono come and sort of address General Sullivan and argue for their neutrality, but he didn't have any of it, and he continued with the destructive activities against. And so basically the Americans burned all they came across. I think that they pretty much got every Gayacono settlement because there was really no place for anyone to take refuge afterwards. This is a very local story in the Ithaca area. One of the detachments that was led by Colonel William Butler came down the east side of Seneca Lake, and it more or less probably took what's East Shore Drive as part of their route. They went a little bit south of Ithaca in the Buttermilk Falls vicinity, where they burned a settlement of Tutelos who had taken refuge with the Gayacono just in that particular area. So this is very much a local story. There was another force under Dearborn who went down the west side of Cayuga Lake and burned everything that they came through, that they saw there. But it's definitely true that Butler's troops encountered more houses. There was not really any pitched battles here. I think that the size of the American force, they had over 4,000 soldiers, and the British and their allies could not compete with those numbers. So basically, the folks would retreat as soon as the Americans were near, and the Americans entered unoccupied villages for the most part, and then burned them down. They burned the houses, they burned any stored food, they cut down all of the crops that were growing in the field. This was sort of in August and September when the corn was starting to ripen. So they cut all of that down and burned it or threw it in the lakes or in the rivers. And they also found fruit trees, and they cut those down and burned those as well. So there's certainly a lot of commemoration of the Sullivan-Clinton campaign on the landscape of the Finger Lakes. I suspect that many of you may have seen, some of the plaques that say Indian Village burned here, or some of the larger brass or bronze plaques that are illustrated in the lower left. There was a commemorative postage stamp issued in 1929. But I think if you look at the orders that Washington gave to Sullivan, you can see that this expedition was intended to be very, very destructive. And Native people today, and some scholars as well, argue that this was genocidal in its intent. That really the idea was to try and kill as many Gayacono and Seneca people as possible. So these are Washington's words originally. The expedition that you are appointed to command is to be directed against the hostile tribes of the Six Nation of Indians with their associates and adherents. The immediate objects are the total destruction and devastation of their settlements and the capture of as many prisoners of every age and sex as possible. It will be essential to ruin their crops now in the ground and prevent their planting more. parties should be detached to lay waste all the settlements around with instructions to do it in the most effectual manner, that the country may not be merely overrun, but destroyed. So he really was talking about a plan for total devastation. And in many ways, this worked exactly according to plan. He mentions prisoners here. There were not very many prisoners taken during the course of the expedition. And that's always been a little bit of a mystery to scholars, but I think certainly because they didn't encounter that many people outside of a few battles very early in the campaign may have had something to do with it. So the Gaecono at this point had no homes or food. And because of the American expeditions, they didn't have any of their fellow Haudenosaunee to be able to take shelter with. So this put them in a very, very difficult position. And I'll note at the time that the travel infrastructure was mainly for foot and water traffic. There was really not very much adoption of horses. There certainly were not wagon roads, oxen, anything like that in the communities in 1779. So they were really forced to go on foot, and the closest place where they could take refuge was with the British at Fort Niagara, which is roughly 140 miles away overland. So oral tradition, there's not much documentation about what the Gaecono actually did in the aftermath of Sullivan Clinton, but there are oral tradition stories that talk about when they gathered everybody together from all the burned out settlements. They remember having the very difficult discussions with elderly and immobile people about how they would not be able to take them with them to Fort Niagara, and thus that they had to leave them behind by the lake and face almost certain death. And it certainly was 140 miles later. It was not much better. The Gaecono historian Steve Henhock said that at the end of the march, there were no babies and no old people left in the community because they had either had to be left behind or had died en route. So in many ways, I think that we can consider this to be a Gaecono Trail of Tears to a certain degree. The British were not prepared for this, for this many. There were at least 5,000, probably quite a few more refugees that showed up at Fort Niagara, and it was a very harsh winter, so many more people died either of exposure or starvation at Fort Niagara. At that point, the Gaecono divided. Some stayed in what is now Western New York with the Senecas. Some moved to Canada. Some went to Ohio, and those are some of the people that eventually ended up in Oklahoma. But it is the case that others returned to Cayuga Lake. So this is something that I think is very poorly understood, both by historians and by local residents, is that there was a period, there are some Gaecono who returned to the lake as of about 1780. And there was really not too much American presence in the area until about 1788. And it does look like there were a fair number of Gaecono people into the early 1800s. So I think that we're talking about a period of either renewed Gaecono control of the territory or co-residence with some of the early American settlers for almost 20 years. So most of the resettlement took place at the north end of Cayuga Lake, where some of the larger communities had been before Sullivan Clinton. But the more that I've looked around, the more evidence I find for Gaecono being in and around Ithaca, between 1788 and 1800. And here you can see the removal of the plaque from DeWitt Park that was talking about the first white settlers that was taken out in October 2020 over some controversy over why there was the emphasis on white settlers as opposed to indigenous people, and also because there was a Black person within that first group of settlers in 1788 who was erased from history. And so there are historical records. I think it's interesting to go and look through the county histories, and you find a lot of accounts of sort of sometimes misunderstandings between Indigenous people and some of the very early settlers, and sometimes productive relations or mutual aid. And it does look like the Gayacono were trading with the early settlers, dealing in things like furs, baskets, maple syrup, or salt, which Indigenous peoples were very skilled in producing and continue to be so after the early settlers arrived. And I do draw your attention to the map in the lower left, which is from about 1794. This was actually a map of the Watkins and Flint purchase, which is to the south of us. What they do show is the existence at that time of a couple of Indigenous communities, including one in what is now Montour Falls. But you can see the one that I've circled there. And if you line up all the creeks and rivers, it looks like that was a Gayacono settlement in what is now Cayuga Heights. That was some of the people that were probably trading furs, baskets, maple syrup, and salt with the early American Ithacans. And I note Anne Lemley's question about only learning about the 5 nations. Yes, that's a mistake. The Tuscaroras joined later in the 1700s, but certainly, I think that if you're talking about 5 nations, you're only learning ancient history and not the modern history, and all of those nations still exist, of course. So there, in the early stages, there were a number of treaties that were conducted with the Haudenosaunee or with the Gayacono individually. And so one of those early treaties formed a reservation. You can see the boundaries in 1789. That was all at the north end of the lake. So that was the only place that was officially Gayacono territory, although they continued to live in other parts of their homeland. So then there was a federal treaty of Canandaigua where the US government pledged to protect Gayacono, the Gayacono reservations and the other existing reservations at that particular time. But then New York State, acting on its own, really chipped away at the reservations. In 1795, New York State reduced the reservation from 64 to 6 square miles, and they did so by only negotiating with Gayacono people who were living near Buffalo at the time and not the ones who were living near Cayuga Lake. So that's why I call it a divide and conquer technique. Then in 1807, the state purchased the 2 tracts on the east side of the lake and leased the one remaining tract on the west side. And then in 1841, the state had finished paying for the final tract on the west side of the lake. What's notable about all of these actions is that every single one of them violated the Federal Trade and Intercourse Act, which said that the federal government had to have a representative at any instance where land was being acquired from Indigenous peoples, and New York ignored that in each of those instances. And this, of course, set the stage for the land claim that happened starting in the late 1970s. So most of the Gayacono who were left here either moved to the 6 Nations Reserve in Ontario, to Seneca reservations, or eventually to Oklahoma. And as of 1807, the Gayacono were left with no official reservation territory in New York State. Then I think we can say that there was insult added to injury, that the American and the Canadian governments felt that their ways of life, their Western ways, were superior, and they tried to force directed programs of education and cultural change on the Haudenosaunee and other Indigenous peoples. So many of you will be familiar, especially given what's been in the news lately about finding unmarked graves of children at residential schools. Children were forcibly taken to residential schools, and here are pictures of a couple of them: the Thomas Indian School, which was on the Seneca Cattaraugus Reservation, and the Mohawk Institute, which is very close to the 6 Nations Reserve in Brantford, Ontario. And there are very likely to have been substantial numbers of Gayacono children who attended both of those schools, and conditions at both of them were pretty horrific. There was a lot of abuse, there was a lot of disease, and there were also attempts both at the schools and in the reservations to convert Indigenous peoples to Christianity, to adopt the English language, to adopt Western style, American or Canadian style names, and also to undermine some of the key tenets of Haudenosaunee social organization by emphasizing political control by males, single family residences, and other changes in gender systems, which greatly reduced the political and economic roles of Haudenosaunee women. And part of this, I think, this sort of imposition of new forms on Indigenous people, the settler governments encouraged the creation of Western style governments for Indigenous nations. So one of the things that's done, the US governments, both at the national and state level, recognize only individual nations. They don't recognize the Haudenosaunee Confederacy any longer. So negotiations are done sort of on a piecemeal basis rather than in a united way. But one of the things they did was that they sort of created Western style governments that were easier to deal with. The Haudenosaunee have a system where they have multiple chiefs and clan mothers. So the Gayakono, if everything was fully staffed, they actually have 10 chiefs that all have equal roles. There's nobody who's the paramount. There's nobody who is sort of the decider in this particular system. And each of those chiefs is advised by a female clan mother. And there really has to be consensus by all of those people in order to make a decision. And so clearly the United States and Canadian systems, they're used to presidents, chairman of the board, chief executive operators, chief executive officers, council presidents, that sort of thing. So they often imposed an apical system of government that had only one person at the top because it was easier to deal with. But at the same time, the traditional governments have continued to exist. And sometimes you have these sort of opposing multiple systems of government, often have disagreements on policy options and the use of resources. And this has had a major effect on the Gayakono. This is what's really being played out in the governance crisis that's happening today. But I think that we have to consider that this sort of factionalism is not something that it's just because Native people are that way. But I really think we have to see this as an effect of colonialism. And therefore, I think that the United States and Canada are really responsible for creating this factionalism. So the Gayakono, although they were essentially exiled from their traditional homelands as of about 1807, they have said, based on oral tradition, that they've always had eyes on their territory. That they had people watching what the settlers were doing with the territory, looking for opportunities to come back. Much of that activity, especially in the 19th century, I think would not have been welcomed. So it's certainly possible that people were doing this surreptitiously, perhaps living in the swampy lands, once again, to try and keep themselves away from the prying eyes of the settlers. So they've had that kind of informal way of monitoring what's happening in their ancestral homelands, but they've also tried a number of more official ways to reestablish themselves in the traditional homeland. And if you go through the historical record between 1807 and 2003, you will see that they used just about every avenue that they had at their disposal, including petitions to the New York State legislature, attempts to get congressional action and federal laws passed, action in the federal courts, petitioning the Canadian government to help out with the United States and New York State, international efforts, both with the League of Nations and before World War II and the United Nations afterwards. Then also some sort of quasi-legal efforts, and I'd kind of characterize some of the recent land purchases and businesses in that category. And they've also sought to influence public opinion through education and public presentations and that sort of thing. So I guess even though there's a period of almost 200 years of exile, official exile, I don't think we can say that the Gaekono have been disconnected from their homelands. So many of you, I guess, in this demographic may be quite familiar with the land claim case, especially in some of its earlier manifestations. The Gaekono filed their case against New York in 1980, and it was based on the fact that New York State had violated federal law in all of those treaties in the 1790s and the early 1800s because there was no federal representative presence. So the Gaekono, there were many attempts at, I think, a legislative settlement, and there were actually very similar lawsuits in Connecticut, in Maine, in Massachusetts that were quite successful and ended up getting land and federal recognition for some of the indigenous nations in those territories. So I think in the beginning, things looked very promising for the Gaekono. They were looking for financial settlement, but in particular, they were looking for land. And some of you may remember there were some proposals that intended to present the Gaekono with Sampson State Park or part of the Seneca Army Depot to sort of resolve these land claims, but nothing ever came of it. They won positive judgments in federal court. New York State was determined to be liable in a 1987 decision. And then there was a jury trial in 2000. One of the things that was struck out was the idea that any territory would happen, and the court said that they were only going to award the Gaekono cash for damages. The court proposed a settlement of roughly $250 million in 2001, and many people, the idea was sort of the purchase price of the reservation in 1794, 1795, plus interest on that money. There were a lot of people that argued that that was entirely inadequate. But the jury trial did find New York State liable and proposed damages. This was challenged by New York State and the money was never awarded. But eventually in federal court in 2005, they determined that the Gaekono claim was no longer valid because it would be too disruptive to settlers after such a long period of settler occupation. This was using the legal doctrine that is known as laches, and the logic here followed Ruth Bader Ginsburg's majority opinion in the decision City of Sherrill versus Oneida Indian Nation of New York, which similarly threw out Oneida claims against the state. So Ruth Bader Ginsburg is revered in many corners, not so much among indigenous people because of this set of decisions that basically said it was so long ago. Yes, New York State erred. It broke the law, but it was so long ago that there was no damages due, not even monetary ones. The Gaekono pressed this to the Supreme Court, but they declined to review the case, which essentially killed the land claim efforts in 2006. But at the same time, the Gaekono began to take more direct action. You can see that the full scope of the land claim case took 26 years, and many Gaekono were quite frustrated with the very, very slow pace of activity, and they wanted to do something a little bit more direct in order to reestablish themselves in their homelands. So really what they've done is exploited legal ambiguities and some of the gaps between local, state, and federal laws to try and reestablish themselves. They've concentrated in the areas that were protected by the 1794 Treaty of Canandaigua, so that's why most of the Gaekono activity has been up north rather than in the Ithaca area. But they've purchased lands, homes, and businesses on the open market. It's in some instances paying quite a bit over market price in order to secure land and businesses. And the Cayuga Nation owns about 1,800 acres currently. And there's been quite a bit of disagreement with localities and New York State about exactly what this means. But it's important to recognize that there are different groups with different goals within the Gaekono, And there was a brief period of unity, but a governance crisis really erupted very soon after this reoccupation took place in 2004, and it really continues to today. So here are a couple of images of the resistance to the reestablishment of the Gayacono. A lot of this focused on taxation, that there was many local residents felt that the Gayacono should have to pay property taxes, school taxes, and the like, and that local residents were being forced to foot the bill because the Gayacono were not being good neighbors. And so here's just a few historical images of some of the protests against the Gayacono coming back to the area at the north end of the lake. But what you started to see with the split in 2004 was a distinction between the traditional government and I guess a group that's more oriented towards economic development that calls itself the Cayuga Nation of New York. And I'll just try and lay this out for your, so you can hopefully see the contrast here. So traditional governance has existed for 500 years, 1,000 years, possibly more. As I described just a second ago, it's led by chiefs or sachems, who in Gayacono are called Hodianeso, and clan mothers, which in Gayacono are called Ganaga Gaeha. And so there are 10 chiefs for the Gayacono. In the Confederacy, there are a total of 50 chiefs spread across the 6 nations. Government is done by consensus, and you are born into being Gayacono. Anyone who has a Gayacono mother is considered to be a member of the Gayacono traditional government, and it doesn't matter where you're born, in Italy, in Canada, in Peru, in New York City, or in the homelands. As long as your mother is Gayacono, then you are as well. And so members are mostly concentrated in what settlers term New York State, Oklahoma, and Ontario, although there are others. Those are the main concentrations, but of course there are individuals and families really all across the globe. On the other hand, the Cayuga Nation of New York, is what is recognized by the US federal government and the New York state governments. This, in contrast to traditional governments, is defined by residents. Only those Gayacono who live in New York State are considered to be members. If you're Gayacono from Ontario or from Oklahoma, the federal and New York state governments consider you to be part of a separate polity rather than the Cayuga Nation of New York. And this is something that is very definitely governed by the actions of the US Bureau of Indian Affairs, or BIA. The way that the United States sort of regulates indigenous governments is through the BIA, and there's an awful lot of rules and regulations that have to be met with in order to continue to have federal recognition. So originally, the Cayuga Nation of New York government arose from traditional decisions. So there were the chiefs and clan mothers sort of decided who was going to represent the Cayuga Nation of New York. There was not a real big distinction between the two types of governments. But Clint Halftown, who's shown here, who is the current leader of the Cayuga Nation of New York, he received an endorsement from the traditional people to act as the federal representative in the very early 2000s. And what happened is that the traditional people saw that role as having a very limited number of functions, but Halftown expanded on those very, very quickly and started to negotiate with New York State in ways that the traditional people did not agree with at all. So Halftown, starting in 2004, he began to negotiate a land claim settlement with Governor Pataki. Remember, this is while the land claim was still active in the federal courts, and he agreed to drop the land claim in exchange for the establishment of a casino, a Cayuga-run casino in the Catskills, and other provisions. That agreement eventually failed, but a lot of the traditional leaders were opposed to gaming, and they argued that Clint Halftown had exceeded his authority. And his clan mother said, "You are no longer the federal representative for us." But Halftown argued that the documentation that he had received from the traditional people overrode the decisions of the clan mothers, and he refused to step down. So at that point, we can really start to talk about the different goals of the Cayuga Nation of New York, the federally recognized enterprise, and the traditional group. So what the Cayuga Nation of New York has done has been very much oriented towards economic development. So they purchased 2 gas stations and convenience stores. They sold gasoline and cigarettes without charging New York State excise taxes, which they said that they had the sovereign right to do this based on the Treaty of Canandaigua, the fact that the 1794 reservation had never been officially extinguished by the proper actions. They have not paid local property taxes. They established gaming parlors at the north end of the lake, and there were a whole bunch of local actions where there was nuisance legislation that prohibited gaming, and there was a raid on the stores to seize cigarettes without tax stamps. And as you've seen, there was mainstream protest over non-payment of property taxes. The Cayuga Nation of New York has challenged all of these things in court, and I would say that remarkably it has won in each of those instances. So the courts have determined that a virtual reservation still exists, even if a real one isn't actually on the ground. So in other words, they do not need to charge excise taxes. Mainstream governments, there's also been a court decision that mainstream governments cannot sue the Cayuga Nation of New York in court because they have sovereign immunity. So therefore, there's no real mechanism to get them to pay the property taxes. And also federal regulatory bodies have approved the gaming compact with the Cayuga Nation of New York, which means that their gaming operations are also legal despite local opposition. So, but the split continued to intensify. In May of 2005, the Cayuga Nation of New York circulated ballots among its members and proposed to form a governmental council, and they claimed a victory with 2/3 majority. The traditionalists argued that this was entirely invalid, that Gayacono people don't vote and they don't do majority rule. They do consensus, so that they said that this was not a valid new government, although the Bureau of Indian Affairs said that it was, and continued to recognize Halftown's operations. The traditionalists formed a separate government that was called the Unity Council in 2010. It was led by the Hodianeso, or chiefs Sam George and Chuck Jacobs. There's a picture of Sam George there, and he has a pretty high public profile, and some of you may have seen him in operation in the Ithaca area. So the BIA recognized the Unity Council as a legitimate government in 2014, but then they rejected that decision in 2016. So you can see the BIA has really gone back and forth here and has really, I think, contributed to the mass confusion over who is the legitimate government. But of late, they have definitely been in the position where they have supported the Cayuga Nation of New York as the legitimate government for all Gayacono people. In 2014, the traditionalists attempted to take over those 2 gas station and convenience stores that were run by CNNY. They succeeded in taking over the facility in Seneca Falls and some of the surrounding land and businesses, but they didn't succeed in Union Springs. So what you really had was sort of 2 sets of stores that were one operated by each faction, and that situation really persisted for about 6 years. So what the Cayuga Nation of New York has done more recently since that split, they've really expanded their businesses. They have a lakeside trading gas station and store in Union Springs. They have a gaming facility in Union Springs, but they've also bought and operated a towing company, a spring water company, a cattle ranch, a garden that grows fruits and vegetables for distribution to members of the nation and for sale. They've also started what is called a premium quality hemp for a line of CBD products that are also grown at their farms. They have a farm stand and tobacco shop called Cayuga Corner. And there have been reports that the Cayuga Nation of New York has purchased quite a few other businesses that operate outside of New York State. They've also tried to institutionalize themselves by creating a police force and a criminal court in 2018. Most of these, the positions here, I think that they are entirely staffed by non-Indigenous people, most of whom had roles either as judges, state troopers, police officers in the mainstream justice system. And you can see a 2018 picture of the officers of the Cayuga Nation of New York's police department there in the lower left. And on the upper right is Clint Halftown. He's wearing the American Eagle sweatshirt and some of the water that they were from Hartford Glen spring water. What did the traditional Gayacono do in that time? I would say that mainly they did not focus on economic enterprises, but they sought to strengthen culture. They constructed a cultural building or school in Seneca Falls. You can see a picture of the interior of that building from 2017. They've taught language and culture classes for Gayacono people. They've replanted heirloom crops that have been maintained since the time of Sullivan Clinton, or perhaps the final expulsion in 1807, and have brought them back to the homeland. And by all accounts, they do very well. I would say that they've warily engaged with some mainstream institutions, including the History Center, where Gayacono people, including Sam George, were partnered with the History Center to create some new Gayacono related exhibits. And there also have been Gayacono language classes for outsiders at Cornell since 2019. And I was very privileged to be able to participate in that class last fall, although I will say that I'm a terrible language learner, and I can't say much more Gayacono than those few words that I've related to you today. Another thing that that has happened is that the Cayuga Nation of New York in particular has petitioned the federal government using what is called the land into trust process. So what happens here is the federal government can create or expand official reservation territory if it approves one of these petitions. If approved, the title of the land is actually held by the Secretary of the Interior in trust for the use of Indigenous nations. And so there have been a number of petitions that if any of these ends up being successful, the Cayugas could have a formal, full-fledged reservation in their territory for the first time since 1807. The Oneida Nation has used this very, very successfully, and they've actually expanded their reservation by over 13,000 acres, sort of in the area of Verona, New York, in the last couple of decades. But the Cayuga Nation of New York petitioned to have the BIA to have 129 acres taken into trust in 2005. And as you can see, this also has taken a massive amount of time that the BIA rejected the application as being incomplete in 6 years later. It doesn't really look like that was a high priority of theirs to review that application, perhaps because it was controversial. But the Cayuga Nation of New York submitted a new application in 2012 for 114 acres. And I'll say a little bit more about that in just a second. So in February 2020, I'm sure that many of you were aware that there was a violent conflict between the traditional people and the federally recognized government. So in other words, between the Gayacono and the Cayuga Nation of New York. I showed you a picture of the inside of that school or culture building. On the left, what happened in the middle of the night, the Cayuga Nation of New York brought in their police force and others, and they stormed onto the grounds of where the traditionalists had their gas station and convenience store, their school building, a daycare center, and a couple of other businesses and residences. And they came in there in the middle of the night, rounded everyone who was there up, zip tied them on their knees in the parking lot, and proceeded to have heavy machinery knock down half of every one of those buildings, enough to make them completely unusable. So this, the picture on the right is the half destroyed school building on the morning of February 22nd, 2020. Here's a picture, sort of before and after pictures of the traditional Gayacono Daycare Center in operation in 2017. You can see it there, half destroyed in the background. There's some play equipment sort of surrounding that torn down building. So this, of course, was incredibly controversial. There was a lot of local outrage and general outrage by the Indigenous community at the actions of Clint Halftown. He claimed that he was taking over businesses that were rightfully the property of the Cayuga Nation of New York, and that they had the authority to act this way because they were on, they were still had certain reservation rights, and that their police force could do this, but this was contested really all over the place. One thing that happened is that all of the existing traditional leaders of the Gayacono came to the site of this destruction and decried the actions of Clint Halftown. You can see all of the men there who have the fancy headdresses. There were 7 of the chiefs attended, and they made a very direct statement denouncing Clint Halftown, declaring that he had been banished from as being a Gayacono person, and that they were the rightful government for the Gayacono people. Immediately after this press conference, a scuffle broke out. You can see that there were some people who, sorry about that phone call, that's attempted to storm onto the grounds to go back to the location of the school building, and they were met by Cayuga Nation police, and there were also members of the Seneca Falls police. I think a county SWAT team was there, members of the state troopers basically stood with the Cayuga Nation police, although they did not act directly in this in the confrontation. Here are some of the other images. You can see sort of the skirmish line that was formed by the Cayuga Nation police in the black blazers with the state trooper behind them. They used tasers and pepper spray against the people that were trying to get onto the property. And I will note that many of the chiefs who were at the press conference tried to get in the way and stop people from engaging in these fisticuffs. And I think, but there was definitely quite a bit of quite a bit of force was used. I was there. I stayed in the street, but I observed what was happening on this particular day. And there was one particularly chilling moment when members of I think the county SWAT team ran across wearing camouflage fatigues, body armor, and carrying automatic weapons. And they went and they stationed themselves in some high places. And I was quite afraid that that shooting was going to occur there, although luckily that did not happen. In the aftermath of that destruction, there have been lawsuits issued by both sides about the actions of the Gayacono groups, about the actions of the Cayuga Nation of New York police and mainstream law officers. The traditional group was really, again, lost their homes. There were parallels made between what Halftown did and what Solomon Clinton did. They lost their community spaces and their means of livelihood. They've continued to hold classes on language and culture in private homes, and they are seeking to rebuild that the school and hold classes in a new location, although that really has not panned out so far. In August of 2020, the Federal Bureau of Indian Affairs denied the Cayuga Nation's land into trust application, citing the violence and unpredictability of the Cayuga Nation of New York as one reason why they could not acquire trust land. The traditional folks operated a successful fundraiser to pay some of the back taxes on a farm property in Cayuga County that was subject to taxation. The federally recognized group has issued eviction notices to traditionalists. And then interestingly, the Seneca County Board of Supervisors wrote to Secretary of the Interior Deb Haaland advocating for recognition of the traditionalists as the official government rather than the Cayuga Nation of New York. And there have been campaigns using the hashtag must go, hashtag Halftown must go, starting in August 2021 and continuing to this day. So I've got one more slide here. I realize that I'm almost at a full hour here, but I'm hoping that you'll bear with me. So somewhat unexpectedly, in December of last year, the Bureau of Indian Affairs said it was going to take another look at the Cayuga Nation land into trust application, and that they were going to make a decision by this June about whether to accept or reject it. So I think that this seems like, as of August of 2020, the Federal Bureau had said, Cayuga Nation of New York, you're unpredictable and violent. We don't want to provide trust land to sort of institutionalize your operation, give you a full-fledged resolution, but now it looks like that's actually possible. The traditional, I'm going to skip around a little bit. This is mildly out of order, but the traditional group and many of their allies are planning an event in Washington, D.C. I think it's going to be in May of this year, where they're going to present their case to the BIA and to the Secretary of the Interior, Deb Haaland, to argue that they are in fact the legitimate government for the Gayacono rather than the Cayuga Nation of New York. And I guess one other thing that happened, which was very reminiscent of what happened in February 2020, is that the Cayuga Nation of New York took over Pipekeepers Tobacco and Gas, which is on Bayard Street in Seneca Falls. Members of the traditional group had leased this store. They did not get approval from the chiefs and clan mothers, but they leased the store and started to sell tax-free gas and cigarettes, sort of, operating on their own a little bit. The Cayuga Nation went to the owners of the building and they purchased it for $1 million on December 28th, which was way over market price for that particular operation. And they didn't tell the people that were operating Pipekeepers Tobacco and Gas that they had done so. Instead, they went in at 3 o'clock in the morning on New Year's Day and took over the place. And there was again a scuffle and some violence that took place during the takeover. So it seems, that this is, even if they bought the place 3 days earlier, that they waited until the middle of the night and did so violently. So again, it seems like they're still more or less using the same playbook. So this basically, I think, brings you up to date. I told you it was going to be complicated, but one of the things I wanted to mention here, just to follow up, is that despite all of these conflagrations and violence that's taking place in our backyard, what I want to stress here is that this is part of the Gayacono working against tremendous odds to try and reestablish themselves in their traditional territory, to get something that they can rely on, both in terms of having a land base and a way to make a living in today's economy. But it's really an expression of their ongoing connection to lands and waters. There are a lot of people who saw, sort of the new occupation by Gayacono people in 2003 as sort of coming out of nowhere. But what I hope I've tried to indicate to you today is that it's part of an ongoing strand and an ongoing connection to the lands and waters in the Cayuga Lake Basin that really cannot be severed. And although you may question some of the actions of some of the parties, or may feel that one or other of those two factions is more legitimate than the other, I think that both of them are acting out of this desire to reestablish themselves in their traditional homelands, which has great power and value to whether you're a member of the Cayuga Nation of New York or the traditional Gayacono. Okay, so thanks very much. I'll be happy to consider any comments or questions if you have them. I'm going to stop sharing now.
Thank you so much. I now understand. I didn't realize that there was a formal Cayuga Nation as opposed to the Guyanacono.
Okay,
I said it.
yeah.
Why did that half town start that? And I wondered proportionally how many belong to each faction.
I guess the numbers are contested. Halftown claims that there are about 500 supporters or members of the Cayuga Nation of New York. The others, it's hard to say because you'd have to include people in Oklahoma, in Ontario, all over the place. I think that those are definitely much more numerous. And there is a group of traditionalists that's living in the Union Springs and Seneca Falls areas right now. I would say that they're outnumbered by the Cayuga Nation of New York folks, but I don't really know the exact number.
Well, why did he form this in the first place?
I think his opponents say that he's greedy and power hungry. And so, I guess that's certainly one explanation. Although if you look at all the court cases that the Cayuga Nation of New York has won and some of the institutions that they've built and their economic base, it's I think in some ways you could look at that and see it as being a phenomenal achievement. But was it based on, the traditionalists would argue that he had no legitimacy for doing any of these things, and particularly that some of the actions such as selling as gaming or potentially moving into selling marijuana are very opposed by the traditionalists.
I have other questions, but somebody else should.
Kurt, my husband and I and some friends go to Niagara on the Lake every summer, except the last 2 years. And we stay in a house called Six Nations House. It was quite new. It was built for, renting through VRBO, but it's owned by an actual member of the Six Nations who was the associate director of the museum, the American Indian Museum at the Smithsonian.
Okay.
And he's got all kinds of artifacts in it and more history. And so what I've learned today will really make it even more meaningful when we stay there. And when I read more of the books and things that he has at the house.
Oh, that's great.
I don't feel that ancient, even though I did learn ancient history when I was in grade school. But we only learned the 5. We never learned the Tuscarora. So anyway, thank you. It was, having spent my entire life in New York. Wow, you just opened me up to a whole bunch of new stuff that I just, didn't know about. I appreciate it.
Great. Yeah, I think, Barbara mentioned the book. I'm not, I don't really get any benefit from sales from it, but there is, this is kind of laid out in the book with a little bit more detail. And the thing that the book also has is it goes back to the last ice age, so that there's all that sort, the actual ancient history is presented as well, which I obviously didn't have time to present today. So. Wendy? You're muted, Wendy. Still muted.
There we go. Thank you. I learned a lot. Appreciate it so much. I also just am going to go back to people who've lived in Ithaca for 30 or so years. I believe the Cayuga Nation or Native people had higher visibility on the Cornell campus, because I'm remembering there used to be a longhouse at the Cornell plantations. Do you guys remember that? And why was it removed? And was there some sort of decision, and probably it was erected as a memory or as an honor to their culture. I would like to see more visibility of the Native people at Cornell, like with a longhouse. I don't know.
Okay.
Does anybody else remember that?
Yeah, Robin,
Yeah.
Robin says yes.
Robin, you do?
And too.
Okay.
Okay, all right.
Does
I don't.
anybody know
so-
why it was removed? No. Okay.
well,
Thanks.
that's interesting. I'll have to follow up on that.
Piece of history.
Yeah. That might have been in my gap. I was here as a kid until 1988, and then I came back in 1997. So maybe I missed it.
I think you, yeah.
Persephone,
You're muted.
you're muted.
Who is
Uh,
it?
What's the symbology of the logo we saw with the rectangles and I guess a pine tree in the middle? And tell me again which group that belongs to, which
Okay, so
faction.
that's a wampum belt. It's called the Hiawatha Belt, and it represents the original 5 nations of the Confederacy. So there are 4 squares or rectangles
Yeah.
that represent 4 of the nations. The pine tree represents the Onondaga Nation because they're the central fire, the meeting place of the Confederacy. So that was the original 5. The Tuscaroras aren't represented on the Hiawatha Belt, but they're part of the Confederacy today. So that, I guess I would say that represents the Haudenosaunee is the best way to think about it.
Thank you.
Yep. Robin.
Are there any efforts to bring these factions together in some way? I mean,
Oh, no.
what's happening to try to mend this in some capacity?
I would say that's very, very difficult since 2020, just because of the level of physical violence that has taken place. It's very clear that these groups don't like each other, and I don't think there's much potential to bring them together. Especially, I think that in some ways, whatever happens to the land into trust application is going to be really critical this summer. That certainly if the BIA endorses it, then the Cayuga Nation of New York will have a much more secure basis for their operations. And I think it would be very difficult for the traditionalists to unseat them at that point. But I think, really, I think a lot that's going on is it's kind of an all or nothing, sort of bid to get official status. And the BIA, as I said, they've waffled on this, and really, I think are maybe one would say that they're actively trying to not make a decision, but we'll see.
The optics are horrible with these guys black with the. I mean, Deb Haaland maybe will. I don't know. Think of something, because it seems it's just horrible. It's very authoritarian, kind of Nazi looking. Anyway.
I think people thought that maybe Deb Haaland would do something, but she hasn't acted either. Granted, it hasn't been very long, but I think actually the sort of reviewing the land into trust sort of suggests the opposite. So, Barbara.
Are there any other native tribes that have the same problem?
Of the division between the governments?
Yes.
Yeah, just about all of them. So I think that there are some places where there are some reservations that are governed by traditional governments. So I think, if you were thinking, oh, the BIA, they'll never recognize a traditional government, that's not true. The Tuscarora Nation, the Onondaga Nation, and the Senecas who live at Tonawanda are all governed by chiefs and clan mothers, and they're all federally recognized. But there are in many other cases, there have been imposed forms of government. It's a real problem across the U.S. and across Canada as well.
One thing that really bothers me, why does the federal government still have so much control over Native American affairs?
Yep, that bothers a lot of Indigenous people too. It's simply the way that it's been set up is that there's an enormous amount of power invested in the federal government, that really sovereignty, Indigenous autonomy and their ability to act is regulated really strongly by the Bureau of Indian Affairs. So in other words, the Bureau of Indian Affairs has to approve citizenship rules. They can reject or endorse particular elections. As I said, the reservation territories, the title is actually held by the Secretary of the Interior. So, you know, it's really, there are enormous limits placed on Indigenous people's ability to do what they want to.
That's not right, in my opinion.
Tom.
My expertise on Native affairs is in the Southwest and West, but what you said is exactly right. That factionalism goes all across the country, but there's 400 groups, there's 400 ways it happens. It's not, there's no one thing. The issue of the federal government control goes back to the Constitution, where Indians were recognized as nations. That's the language of the Constitution. And they have a direct pipeline to the federal government, so they can bypass city, state, county governments. They go straight to the top. And part of the factionalism is driven by local people wanting to get control. This is sort of a standard thing. And the feds, some often, but not all the time, protecting groups against these other local groups trying to take them over. And that leads to, you know, lots of very serious fighting. And to give you a simple example, if there's a felony committed on a recognized Indian reservation, FBI has jurisdiction if it's a serious felony. The local cops can't come in unless the FBI or the tribe invites them. And so that creates a great deal of problem. But so this all sounds like so familiar to me of arguments that have happened throughout the West, but it's a very general kind of thing, and it goes back to the Constitution in terms of the way things were set up.
Yeah, thank you, Tom. That's everything you've said there is absolutely right. I guess there are a couple of pretty fundamental Supreme Court decisions as well that were written by John Marshall in the 1820s and maybe into the 1830s, where they originally in the Constitution, Indigenous governments are considered to be nations, which has the same status as countries, right? So that it was an international relationship between the United States and let's say the Cherokee Nation, similar to what it would be between the United States and France. And then John Marshall came in and said unilaterally, no, that's not right. Indigenous nations are actually domestic dependent nations. That he sort of downgraded the status of Indigenous nations. And so there's I think there's a strong legal argument that you can't do that, right? That we can't just say, Canada, you're not an independent nation anymore, or, it's a violation of sovereignty that's, not unlike what Russia's trying to do to the Ukraine. So, but nonetheless, that's accepted federal law. It's part of federal policy that Indigenous nations are domestic dependent nations rather than fully independent.
Mm. Well,
there's a lot to talk about.
Yeah, thank you so much. That was very informative.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, my pleasure.
It's wonderful.
That keeps us thinking.
Thank you, Kurt. It was great. Really.
Yeah, thank you all for the invitation, and I believe the recording is